The first splinter of a cold blue dawn was just beginning to cut through the mist that clung to Black Bear Ridge, and my old bones felt it before my eyes saw it. It's a dampness that seeps in, a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature of the room and everything to do with the 68 winters I have weathered in these mountains. I sat up in the bed that my Robert built, the solid oak headboard cool against my back. For a moment, just a fleeting, hopeful moment, I expected to hear his steady breathing beside me, the familiar rhythm that had been the soundtrack to my life for nearly 5 decades. But the only sound was the house itself, groaning and settling as it woke, a lonely echo in the vast silence he had left behind. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet finding the worn, handmade rag rug on the floor. Every fiber of it told a story. The blue scraps were from Robert's work shirts, the faded floral ones from my old kitchen aprons, and the bright yellow strips were from the dress our son, David, had torn climbing the big maple tree in the yard when he was 6. This house wasn't just a structure of wood and stone. It was a living album of our lives, and every corner held a ghost of a memory, a whisper of a past I treasured more than anything. I made my way to the kitchen, my hand brushing against the wall, the smooth plaster cool and familiar. Robert and I had plastered these walls ourselves, laughing as we'd ended up with more of it on our clothes than on the lath. The kettle began its low rumble on the stove, a comforting sound in the quiet of the morning. I spooned instant coffee into Robert's favorite mug, the one with a chip on the rim that I could never bring myself to throw away. I stood by the window, looking out as the sun began to burn away the fog, revealing the layers of hills, each a deeper shade of blue than the one before it. This view had saved me in the year after Robert passed. When the grief was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket, I would come to this window and watch the world unfold, and it reminded me that life, in its own stubborn way, continues. The birds still sang, the deer still came to the salt lick by the edge of the woods, and the seasons still turned with a faithfulness that humbled me. This home was our sanctuary, the place we'd escaped to from the noise and rush of the city all those years ago. We'd bought the land with every penny we had, and we'd built this house with our own 4 hands. Robert was a carpenter by trade, a master with wood, and I was his willing, if sometimes clumsy, apprentice. He taught me how to measure twice and cut once, how to read the grain of a plank, how to find the soul in a piece of timber. He used to say, "Helen, a house has to have a soul, or it's just a box to keep the rain out." Our house had a soul. It was made of his strength and my persistence, of summer sweat and winter fires, of lullabies sung to a sleeping baby and quiet conversations in the dead of night. It was this deep, unshakable connection that my daughter-in-law, Rebecca, could never understand. To her, this house was not a soul. It was a problem. An asset on a spreadsheet, a liability. A collection of splinters and drafts and outdated plumbing. She saw dust on the mantelpiece and saw neglect. I saw the fine layer of time settling over a life well lived. She saw the steep, winding driveway and saw a hazard. I saw the path that had led us to our heaven on earth, the same path my son had learned to ride his bicycle on, wobbling with triumphant laughter. Her visits with David had changed over the last year. They used to be filled with warmth, with David tinkering in his father's old workshop and Rebecca helping me in the garden. But now, attention followed them up the mountain. Rebecca's gaze would sweep across the rooms with a critical eye, her lips pursed. Her suggestions started subtly. "You know, Helen, there are some lovely retirement communities in the city, closer to us. They have activities. Socials." I would just smile and change the subject, offering her another slice of my apple cake. I didn't want to go to socials. My social life was with the Finches at the bird feeder and the old tomcat who sometimes slept on my porch. Then the suggestions became more insistent. "Mother Anderson, we're worried about you up here all alone. What if you fell? What if the power went out in a storm?" David would sit uncomfortably, shifting in his chair, caught between the wife he loved and the mother he was raised to respect. He'd say, "Mom's tough, Becca. She's always been fine." But his voice lacked the conviction it once had. I could see Rebecca's influence working on him, planting seeds of doubt and worry that were slowly taking root. The last time they visited, 2 weeks ago, it had been different. There was an edge to Rebecca's voice I hadn't heard before. She had a brochure in her hand, glossy and slick, with pictures of smiling seniors playing shuffleboard. "We've put a deposit down on a place for you, Helen. It's called Golden Meadows. It's perfect. There's a nursing station right on site." I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at the brochure, at the sterile, cookie-cutter rooms and the forced smiles. It looked like a place to wait for the end, not a place to live. I looked at David, my heart pleading with him to understand. "David," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "this is my home. Your father and I built this. My life is here." Rebecca sighed, a long, exasperated sound. "Helen, be reasonable. This house is a falling-apart money pit. It's not safe. The roof needs work. The wiring is ancient. It's a burden. We can sell it, and the money will more than cover your expenses at Golden Meadows for a very long time." The word she'd stopped herself from saying hung in the air between us. Life. She was planning out the end of my life, tidying it away into a neat little box. The casual cruelty of it stole my breath. "This house is not a burden to me," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It is my joy. The roof doesn't leak, and the wiring works just fine. Robert built this house to last." "Robert's gone, Helen," she said, her voice sharp now. "You need to face reality. You're not a young woman anymore. We are trying to do what's best for you." "What's best for me," I repeated softly, "is to be allowed to live out my days in the home I built with my husband, surrounded by the memories we made." "That is not too much to ask." David finally spoke, his voice low. "Mom, maybe just look at the place. For us." I looked at my son, the boy I'd taught to fish in the creek down the hollow, the man who now looked at me with a stranger's pity in his eyes. "No, David," I said, my heart breaking. "I will not look at it. I am not leaving my home." The argument ended there, but the silence that followed was heavier than any words. They left an hour later, the brochure for Golden Meadows sitting on my kitchen table like a threat. The air in the house felt poisoned. I picked up the glossy paper and, with shaking hands, I fed it to the flames in the wood stove. I watched the smiling, generic faces curl into ash, and I prayed that was the end of it. I was so terribly wrong. The call had come yesterday afternoon. It was Rebecca. Her voice was cold, stripped of all pretense of warmth. "Helen, David and I have been talking. We can't, in good conscience, allow you to stay there. You've left us no choice." "No choice about what, Rebecca?" I asked, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. "You're being irrational," she said, her tone clinical and detached. "You're refusing to accept help. Your stubbornness is putting you in danger. If you won't leave voluntarily, we have to take steps to ensure your safety." A cold fear, colder than any mountain winter, crept over me. "What are you talking about? What steps?" There was a pause, and in that small gap of silence, I heard it. The click of another phone being picked up, a muffled voice in the background. It sounded like she was talking to someone else. Then her voice came back, loud and clear, not directed at me, but at someone else in the room with her. "Yes, officer, that's right. My mother-in-law, Helen Anderson. She lives at 142 Black Bear Ridge. She's elderly and she's becoming a danger to herself. She's confused, refusing to leave a property that is unsafe. We're afraid she might hurt herself. We need someone to go out there. We need you to remove her from the home." The phone fell from my hand, clattering against the pine floorboards. I didn't even hear it land. The words echoed in my head, a horrifying, unbelievable refrain. Remove her from the home. She had called the police. My son's wife had called the police to have me thrown out of my own house. The house Robert and I had poured our souls into. It wasn't a disagreement anymore. It wasn't a difference of opinion. It was a declaration of war, and I was the enemy. I sank into Robert's old armchair, the one with the worn leather and the perfect indentation from where he always sat. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stop the shaking that had taken over my entire body. I looked around the living room, at the fieldstone fireplace we had built stone by painstaking stone, at the mantelpiece crowded with photographs of David as a gap-toothed boy, as a lanky teenager, as a proud graduate. My life was in this room. My history. My love. And they were sending strangers in uniform to tear me away from it. The betrayal was a physical pain, a sharp, jagged thing lodged deep in my chest. David. My David. How could he let this happen? How could he stand by while his wife made this monstrous call? The boy who used to run to me for comfort when he scraped his knee was now allowing his wife to inflict a wound so deep I wasn't sure it could ever heal. I sat there in the fading light of the afternoon, and I waited. I waited for the sirens that would signal the end of my world. The waiting was the worst part. It was a torment that stretched each minute into an hour, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall a hammer blow against my already fractured heart. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky outside my window in strokes of orange and violet, a spectacular, beautiful agony. It felt like the world was putting on its finest dress for my execution. I didn't cry. The shock was too deep, the betrayal too profound for tears. It was a cold, hollow space that had opened up inside me, a void where warmth and trust used to be. I couldn't just sit there. I had to move. I stood up, my joints protesting, and began to walk through my home, a final, sorrowful pilgrimage. It was no longer a simple house. It was a museum of a life about to be dismantled. I ran my hand along the bookshelf Robert had built, his initials carved discreetly on the underside of the bottom shelf. I traced the spines of the books, his worn-out poetry anthologies, my gardening manuals with their dirt-smudged pages. Each object was a silent witness, a keeper of a story. I went into David's old room. It was mostly a guest room now, but his presence lingered. On the wall, a faded pencil mark showed how tall he was the summer before he left for college. I remembered holding the ruler steady against the top of his head, his hair smelling of sunshine and freshly cut grass, Robert standing back and saying, "He's going to be taller than me, Helen. Look at that." In the closet, on the top shelf, was a cardboard box filled with his childhood treasures, a collection of oddly shaped rocks from the creek, a shoebox of baseball cards, a poorly made clay pot from a summer art class that I had told him was a masterpiece. I reached up and pulled the box down, dust motes dancing in the slanted evening light. I lifted the lid. The smell of old paper and dried leaves filled my nostrils. This was my son. This box held the essence of the boy I had raised, the boy who loved this mountain, this creek, this house. How could that boy have become a man who would allow this to happen? The question was a constant, looping torment in my mind. I walked back into the living room and my eyes fell upon our wedding photograph on the mantel. Robert and I, so young. He was impossibly handsome in his borrowed suit, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled at me. And me, in a simple white dress my mother had made, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers I'd picked from a meadow that morning. We had nothing but each other and a pocketful of dreams. We made a promise that day, not just to each other, but to the life we would build together. A life of honesty, of kindness, of loyalty. A life where family meant protection, not persecution. I picked up the silver frame, my thumb stroking the cool glass over Robert's face. "Oh, Robert," I whispered into the crushing silence of the room. "What do I do? They're taking it all away." The house was dark now, save for the single lamp I had switched on beside the armchair. I refused to turn on more lights. I didn't want my home to look bright and welcoming to the people who were coming to evict me from it. I wanted it to be shrouded in the gloom that had settled over my spirit. Every sound from outside made me jump. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of a raccoon in the bushes, the distant rumble of a truck on the main road. Each noise was a potential siren, a harbinger of the end. I thought about Rebecca. I truly tried, to see it from her perspective. She was a city girl, born and raised. She valued efficiency, convenience, safety protocols. She saw my life here as impractical, a stubborn refusal to modernize. She probably saw herself as the hero of the story, the responsible one making the tough decision that everyone else was too sentimental to make. She likely told herself she was saving me from a lonely, dangerous future. But there is a canyon of difference between concern and control. Her concern felt like a cage, a way to manage me, to put me somewhere she wouldn't have to worry. Out of sight, out of mind. The most painful part was that she had convinced my son that this cage was a loving gesture. My mind drifted back to a conversation I'd had with Robert a few months before he passed. We were sitting on the porch, watching the fireflies begin their nightly ballet. His breathing was shallow, and I knew our time was running short. He'd taken my hand, his own hand, once so strong and capable, now thin and papery. "Promise me something, Helen," he'd said, his voice raspy. "Promise me you'll stay here. Don't let them ever talk you into leaving. Our roots are in this soil. Your soul is intertwined with these trees. This is where you belong." I had promised. It was a sacred vow, a deathbed promise I intended to keep. And now I was being forced to break it. The shame of that, layered on top of the grief and the betrayal, was almost too much to bear. I must have dozed off in the chair, because I was startled awake by a sound that was not a part of the familiar night. It wasn't an owl or a raccoon. It was the crunch of tires on the gravel of my long driveway. A slow, deliberate crunch. My heart leaped into my throat, pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. I pulled myself up, my legs feeling weak and unsteady, and peered through the living room window. And there they were. The flashing lights, red and blue, silently, menacingly, painting the trunks of the pine trees in ghastly, rotating colors. They hadn't used the siren. Perhaps a small courtesy, a quiet approach so as not to alarm the non-existent neighbors. Or perhaps, more chillingly, they approached with the stealth of someone dealing with a delicate, unpredictable situation. A confused old woman. A danger to herself. A car door opened and closed. A solid, official sound that seemed to seal my fate. Then another. I saw two silhouettes detaching themselves from the vehicle, their forms dark against the flashing lights. They began the slow walk toward my front porch. This was it. The moment I had been dreading. My body was frozen, but my mind was racing. Should I lock the door? Barricade it? The thought was absurd. I was a 68-year-old woman against the law. What could I possibly do? I had only one thing left, my dignity. I would not be dragged out of my home kicking and screaming. I would not give Rebecca the satisfaction of that story. I took a deep, shuddering breath, straightened my cardigan, and smoothed my hair with a trembling hand. I walked to the front door, the floorboards groaning under my feet as if in protest. I reached for the old brass doorknob, its surface worn smooth by a million touches. I would face them on my own terms, on my own porch. The porch where Robert and I had sat for countless evenings, where we had watched thunderstorms roll in over the mountains, where we had held our son's tiny hand and pointed out the constellations. This was my ground. I would not surrender it from a hiding place inside. I turned the knob, pulled the heavy wooden door inward, and stepped out into the cold night air to meet the men who had come to take my life away. Two uniformed officers stood on my porch steps, their faces illuminated in the strobing red and blue lights from their patrol car. One was young, probably not much older than David, with a nervous energy about him. The other was older, my age perhaps, with a face etched by time and experience, his hair a shock of silver under his cap. The younger one seemed ready to speak, to launch into some rehearsed official speech, but the older officer held up a hand, silencing him. His eyes weren't on me. They were scanning the porch, the hand-hewn cedar posts, the intricate joinery of the roof beams. There was a look on his face, not of pity, not of authority, but of something I couldn't quite place. Recognition, maybe, or appreciation. He took a slow breath, and the scent of the pine needles and damp earth seemed to fill the air around us. Finally, his gaze settled on me. His eyes were kind, and that was the most disorienting thing of all. I had braced myself for sternness, for impatience, for the cold face of bureaucracy. I had not prepared for kindness. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "I'm Officer Miller. This is Officer Schmidt. We received a call concerning this residence." I clasped my hands in front of me to keep them from shaking. "I know," I said, my own voice barely a whisper. "My daughter-in-law. She called you." Officer Miller nodded slowly, his eyes still taking in the details of the house. He looked past me, through the open door into the warm, lamplit living room. His gaze lingered on the stone fireplace. "Is this," he started, then paused, as if trying to phrase the question correctly. "Is this Robert Anderson's place?" The sound of my husband's name, spoken with such familiarity by the stranger, caught me off guard. All I could do was nod. A slow smile spread across Officer Miller's face, a genuine, unforced smile that reached his eyes. "I thought so," he said, almost to himself. He looked at the porch swing, swaying gently in the night breeze. "He built this house, didn't he? With his own hands." "Yes," I managed to say, my voice thick with unshed tears. "We both did." He shook his head in admiration. I haven't been up this particular road in 20 years, but I'd know his handiwork anywhere." He turned to his young, bewildered partner. Robert Anderson was an artist with wood, son. A true craftsman. There aren't many left like him. Then he looked back at me, his expression turning more serious, but still gentle. "Ma'am, Mrs. Anderson, your husband, he did something for my family a long, long time ago. It was the big blizzard of '98. My father was a farmer, lived over on the next ridge. His old truck slid into a ditch, right at the bottom of this mountain. No cell service back then, of course. He was stuck, and the temperature was dropping fast." He paused, and I could see the memory playing out in his mind. "Your husband found him. He was on his way back from town and saw the taillights. He spent 2 hours in the freezing cold with a winch and chains, pulling that heavy old truck back onto the road. He wouldn't take a dime for it. Not a single penny. Insisted my dad come in here, into this house, to warm up. Said you gave him a big mug of hot coffee and a slice of pie while he waited for his nerves to settle. A memory, long dormant, surfaced in my mind. A snowy night, a shivering stranger at our kitchen table, gratitude shining in his eyes. Robert, shrugging it off as if it were nothing. It's what neighbors do, he'd said. My father never forgot that. Officer Miller continued, his voice soft. He talked about it for years. The kindness of the man in the house on Black Bear Ridge. He said your husband told him, a man's character is like a house. It's built one good deed at a time. That always stuck with me. At that moment, another set of headlights cut through the darkness, coming up the driveway much faster than the police car had. It was David's SUV. It skidded to a halt behind the patrol car, and David and Rebecca jumped out. Rebecca's face was a mask of grim determination. She strode toward the porch, ready to take charge. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative. She pointed a finger at me. "As you can see, she's not well. She shouldn't be here. We're here to escort her to a safe facility." Officer Miller turned his body slightly, subtly positioning himself between Rebecca and me. It was a small gesture, but it felt like he was shielding me. He looked at her, his kind eyes now firm and unyielding. "Ma'am, is your mother-in-law breaking any laws?" Rebecca was taken aback. "Well, no, but she's a danger to herself. This house is unsafe." She's confused. The officer's gaze shifted to me. "Mrs. Anderson, do you feel confused?" I looked past him, my eyes finding my son's. David stood a few feet behind Rebecca, his face pale in the flashing lights, his expression a miserable mix of guilt and conflict. "No, officer," I said, my voice finding a strength I didn't know it had. "I am not confused. I am heartbroken. I am in my own home, a home I have lived in for 47 years. A home my husband and I built. And my son and his wife are trying to have me forcibly removed." David flinched as if I had struck him. Officer Miller turned back to Rebecca. "Ma'am, I'm looking at a well-kept home. I see a woman who, apart from being deeply distressed by this situation, seems perfectly lucid. I don't see any immediate danger. I don't see any reason for us to remove her from her own property. But we have a place for her." Rebecca insisted, her voice rising in frustration. "We have legal avenues we can pursue. Power of attorney. You may have," Officer Miller said calmly, "but that is a civil matter. A legal matter for lawyers and judges. It is not a matter for 2 police officers on a wellness check. We were told there was an immediate threat. The only threat I see here is to this lady's peace of mind. For tonight, Mrs. Anderson is staying right where she is." He then looked directly at David, and his voice dropped. It was no longer the voice of a police officer, but of a man speaking to another man. "Son," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Your father was a good man. A respected man. He helped my family when we needed it, for no other reason than it was the right thing to do. Are you doing the right thing here? Is this how you honor his memory? By having your mother thrown out of the house he built for her. Every word was a hammer blow to David. I saw his shoulders slump, the fight draining out of him. He looked at the house, at the warm light spilling from the doorway. He looked at me, standing on the porch, my entire world hanging in the balance. He looked at his wife, her face tight with anger and thwarted plans. And finally, something inside him, the boy who loved these mountains, the son of Robert Anderson, broke through. No, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He took a step forward, away from Rebecca. No, this is wrong. Mom, I am so sorry. He looked at Rebecca, and for the first time, I saw him stand up to her. Becca, we're not doing this. It's over. This is her home. Rebecca stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. She had been so certain of his compliance, so sure of her plan. The sight of him defying her, of the police siding with me, left her utterly speechless. Officer Miller gave a slight nod. Our work here is done, he said. He turned to me one last time. Mrs. Anderson, if you need anything, and I mean anything at all, you call us. Directly. Ask for me. He handed me his card. It was an honor to finally see the house your husband built. He and his partner walked back to their car, the crunch of their boots on the gravel a sound of deliverance. The flashing lights were switched off, plunging the yard back into the peaceful darkness of the mountains. They reversed slowly down the driveway and disappeared, leaving the three of us in a heavy, ringing silence. Rebecca finally found her voice, a furious hiss. I cannot believe this. I cannot believe you, she said to David, before turning on her heel, yanking open the car door and slamming it shut. David didn't follow her. He walked slowly up the porch steps and stopped in front of me. Tears were streaming down his face, illuminated by the porch light. Mom, he choked out. I am so sorry. I let her. I got caught up in the worry and her plans. I forgot who you are. I forgot who Dad was. Can you ever forgive me? I looked at my son, my only child, his face a mess of shame and regret. The anger and betrayal I had felt began to dissolve, replaced by the deep, instinctual love of a mother. He had lost his way, but he had found it again. He had come home. I reached out and pulled him into a hug, just as I had when he was a little boy. He held onto me tightly, his body shaking with sobs. It's all right, David, I whispered, stroking his hair. It's all right. We'll fix this. We stood there for a long time, on the porch Robert had built, under the stars he had taught us to name. The argument with Rebecca would come later. The long, difficult conversations about the future would have to be had. The cracks in our family were deep and would take time to mend, if they ever fully could. But in that moment, none of that mattered. My son was back, the house was safe, and the promise I had made to my husband was still intact. I was home, and as I looked out over the dark, sleeping ridges, I felt Robert's presence beside me, not as a ghost of a memory, but as a quiet, steady strength. The soul of the house was safe, and for the first time in a long time, so was mine. The world seemed to hold its breath in the wake of the police car's departure. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, and the ragged, desperate sound of my son's weeping. I held him, my own tears finally falling, mingling with his in the fabric of my old wool cardigan. It was a strange and terrible catharsis. The dam of politeness and strained silences that had been building between us for a year had finally burst, and all the pain and misunderstanding came flooding out into the cold night air. The slam of Rebecca's car door was a sharp, angry punctuation mark to our moment of reconciliation. We both stiffened, but I didn't let go of David. He needed this, and frankly, so did I. Rebecca strode back towards the porch, her face pale and furious in the dim yellow light. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't look at me. Her eyes, blazing with a cold fire, were fixed on her husband. David, get in the car. Now. Her voice was dangerously low, stripped of all emotion except for a chilling command. David pulled away from me slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand. He looked like a boy again, caught between his mother and a schoolyard bully. But then he took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was steady. It was the voice of a man. "No, Becca. I'm not going anywhere." "What did you say?" she asked, disbelief warring with anger. "I said I'm not leaving," he repeated, taking a half step in front of me, a mirror of the gesture Officer Miller had made just moments before. "What we did tonight, what I let happen tonight, was wrong. It was unforgivable. This is my mother's home. This is where I grew up. We are not throwing her out of it like she's nothing. She is not nothing, David. She is a liability." Rebecca shot back, her voice rising. "I have spent months trying to make you see sense. That old man, that cop, filling your head with sentimental nonsense about your father." "Don't you talk about my father," David said, his voice dropping to a growl that surprised even me. "You never knew him. You don't get to use him as an excuse for this. That sentimental nonsense is called character. It's called decency. Things he had, things that officer remembered after 20 years. We came up here tonight to bully an old woman, my mother, out of her life's work. How can you not see how monstrous that is?" "I see that I am trying to be the responsible adult," she cried, her voice cracking with frustration. "While you and your mother want to live in a fairy tale where nothing ever goes wrong and people don't get old and fall. What happens when she breaks a hip, David? When this place catches fire from the ancient wiring? Who's going to deal with that? Me. It will all fall on me." Her fear, twisted as it was into anger and control, was finally laid bare. It wasn't just about money or convenience. It was about her terror of the future, of the messiness of aging and death, things she thought she could manage and sanitize by putting me in a neat, prepackaged box called Golden Meadows. "Then we'll deal with it," David said, his voice softer now, but no less firm. "We'll deal with it as a family. We'll put in new wiring. We'll fix whatever needs fixing. We will show up. That's what families are supposed to do. We don't just ship our problems away." He looked from her to me, and his eyes were filled with a dawning, terrible clarity. "That's what I forgot. I forgot that love isn't about preventing every bad thing from happening. It's about being there when it does." The silence that followed was profound. Rebecca stared at him, her face a canvas of shock and betrayal. She had lost him. In her obsessive quest to control his mother's future, she had shattered his image of her, and perhaps his image of their own life together. Without another word, she turned, got back into the SUV, and with a spray of gravel, she reversed angrily down the driveway and sped away into the night, leaving a trail of dust and shattered assumptions behind her. David watched the taillights disappear, his shoulders slumping. The bravado left him, and he looked utterly exhausted. "Mom," he said, turning to me. "What have I done?" I took his arm. "You did the right thing, son. It was the hardest thing, but it was the right thing." I led him inside, away from the chill of the night and the ghosts on the porch. The house welcomed us, its familiar silence a comforting blanket. I guided him to the kitchen table, to the very spot where Rebecca had laid out her glossy brochure of Betrayal. "Sit," I said gently. "I'll make some coffee." The simple act of filling the kettle, of spooning the dark grounds into the percolator Robert had bought me for our 20th anniversary, was grounding. It was a ritual of normalcy in a world that had been turned completely upside down. The familiar, rich aroma began to fill the kitchen, a scent of home, of mornings, of life carrying on. I set 2 mugs on the table, the chipped one for me and a solid blue one for David. He sat staring at his hands, his knuckles white. "I let it get so far, Mom," he said, his voice raw. "It started so small. A comment here, a suggestion there. She'd say she was worried. And I was worried too. I'm all the way in the city and you're up here. I'd call and you'd sound fine, but she'd plant these seeds. Is she really fine, David? Or is she just telling you she's fine? Older people do that. They hide things. They don't want to be a burden." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. And every time I came up here, she'd point things out. A loose floorboard. A bit of peeling paint on the window frame. To me, it was just the house. The house I've known my whole life. But to her, it was evidence. Proof that you were living in a ruin, that you were in denial. She's very persuasive, Mom. She presents things as facts, as logic. And slowly, her logic started to feel more real than my own feelings. I listened, my heart aching for him, for the subtle, creeping poison he had been subjected to. It was a classic campaign of doubt, and he, wanting to be a good husband and a good son, had been caught in the crossfire until he couldn't tell which was which. She made me feel like if I wasn't actively doing something, like moving you, I was being a negligent son, he continued, his voice cracking. That if anything happened to you, it would be my fault for letting you stay here. The guilt was enormous. I convinced myself that forcing you to leave was a form of love, that it was the only way to protect you. He buried his face in his hands. How stupid. How could I have been so stupid? I was trying to protect you by destroying the one thing that means the most to you. I reached across the table and placed my hand on his. You weren't stupid, David. You were scared. And you were trying to love two people who wanted very different things. That is not an easy place to be. But Dad would have never, he started, his voice choked with shame. He would have never let it get this far. He would have seen right through it. He would have been so disappointed in me. Your father, I said, my voice soft but sure, would have been proud of the man who stood on that porch tonight and found his way back to the right path. It's easy to never get lost, David. It takes real courage to admit you've taken a wrong turn and find your way back. That's what you did tonight. The coffee maker gave a final gurgle, and I got up to pour. As I handed him the warm mug, his hands wrapping around it as if for dear life, I knew this was a turning point. Not just a reprieve, but a fundamental shift. The immediate crisis was over, but the work of rebuilding was just beginning. We sat there for a long time, the clock on the wall ticking a steady rhythm. He talked. He told me everything. About the pressure from Rebecca's family, who had put their own parents in assisted living years ago and saw it as the only sensible option. About the financial planner who had looked at the asset of my house and advised them to liquidate. He spoke of a world so different from mine, a world of spreadsheets and risk assessments, a world that had no column for a soul, for memory, for love baked into the very walls of a home. As he talked, I saw my son not as a betrayer, but as a man caught in a current, swept along by a logic that felt alien to his own nature. He had been drowning, and tonight, Officer Miller had thrown him a lifeline, a rope woven from the memory of his father's character. He had grabbed onto it, and it had pulled him back to shore, back to this house. After the coffee was gone and the words had slowed, a fragile peace settled in the kitchen. Come with me, I said, standing up. I led him out of the kitchen, through the living room, and down the short hall to the back of the house. I opened the door to Robert's workshop. The scent of sawdust, wood stain, and old metal hung in the air, a fragrance as familiar and comforting to me as perfume. It was a sacred space, left almost exactly as it was the last day he'd worked in it. His tools hung in their neat outlines on the pegboard. A half-finished birdhouse sat on the workbench, the pieces of cedar cut and ready for assembly. On a small shelf above the bench was a row of little wooden animals he had carved for David when he was a child. A lopsided bear, a surprisingly elegant deer, a little bird with its head cocked to one side. David walked over to the bench and ran his hand over the smooth, sanded surface of the birdhouse. I remember him teaching me how to use a coping saw in here, he said, his voice thick with nostalgia. My hand was too small to hold it properly. He'd put his hand over mine, and we'd guide the saw together. He picked up the little wooden bear, turning it over and over in his palm. He let me help him build the deck. I was 10. My job was to hand him the screws. I felt like the most important person in the world. He looked around the workshop, at the saws and drills and clamps, at the stacks of lumber leaning against the wall. This is what Rebecca doesn't get, he said, a look of profound understanding on his face. She sees a bunch of old tools and a pile of wood. She doesn't see this. She doesn't see him teaching me patience. She doesn't see the sweat that went into every board of this house. To her, selling it is just a transaction. To us, it would be like bulldozing a cemetery. That's it, David, I said quietly. That's exactly it. He set the little bear back on the shelf, his touch gentle, reverent. I'm going to fix this, Mom. Not just with you. With Becca, too. I don't know how, but I have to try to make her understand. And if she can't, well, I'll deal with that then. He squared his shoulders, a new resolve in his eyes. But my first promise is to you, and to Dad's memory. I'm going to help you keep this place. I'll come up every other weekend. We'll check the wiring. We'll look at the roof. We'll make a list, and we'll work on it together. Just like I used to with Dad. The promise was more than just words. It was a bridge. A bridge back to me, back to his past, back to himself. It was a plan born not of fear and control, but of love and participation. He stayed the night in his old room. I put fresh sheets on the bed, and before I left him, I pointed to the pencil mark on the wall. Your father was so proud that day, I said. He knew you were going to be a fine man. David just nodded, his eyes glistening. I went back to my own room, the bed that felt so empty every night. But tonight, the silence in the house was different. It wasn't the hollow silence of loneliness. It was the peaceful silence of sanctuary. The threat had passed. My son was asleep under my roof. I looked out my window at the moon, a silver disk hanging over the dark, silent ridges. I had kept my promise to Robert. I had held the line. My home was still mine. The fight wasn't over, I knew. The conversation with Rebecca would be a storm I wasn't sure their marriage could weather. But for the first time in a very long time, I felt a flicker of hope, a quiet strength settling back into my bones. I was not a liability. I was a guardian. And tonight, with my son's help, I had guarded our legacy well. The following morning, the sun rose over Black Bear Ridge with a gentle, apologetic light, as if trying to soothe the wounds of the night before. I was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with my chipped mug, when David came in, his hair tousled from sleep, his eyes puffy but clear. He looked around the kitchen, at the familiar worn countertops and the colorful rooster-themed curtains I'd sewn years ago, as if seeing them for the very first time. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot I'd made and sat down across from me. The silence was not awkward, but full of unspoken things, a quiet space for the dust to settle. I called her, he said finally, staring into his mug. I pulled over about 10 miles down the road last night and called. I had to. I held my breath, waiting. And? He sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of the last year. She's furious. Not just at me. At the police officer. At you. At the whole mountain. She said I humiliated her. That I chose you over her. My heart sank. Oh, David. I never wanted to come between you. You didn't, Mom, he said, looking up at me, his gaze firm. She created the situation. She drew a line in the sand and told me to cross it. For the first time, I refused. This isn't about choosing you over her. It's about choosing what's right over what's easy. It's about choosing to be the kind of man Dad raised me to be. He took a sip of coffee. She's staying at her sister's for a few days. She said she needs space. To think. Space. It was a word that could mean anything. It could be the beginning of an end, or a room for healing. I didn't know which, and the uncertainty was a new kind of pain, a dull ache for my son's own fractured home. I'm sorry, David. Truly. Don't be, he said, reaching across the table and squeezing my hand. This needed to happen. For a long time, I've been letting her fears drive our life. My life. Last night, seeing you on that porch, so dignified and so terrified, and hearing that officer talk about Dad, it was like a lightning strike. It woke me up. He let go of my hand, and a new energy entered his voice. Now, where's that loose floorboard Rebecca was always complaining about? And, just like that, the work began. For the rest of the morning, we were not a broken family, but a team. We were Helen and David, apprentices to the memory of Robert Anderson. We found the loose board in the hallway, and David, with a focus I hadn't seen in him for years, pried it up. We looked down into the crawl space, the air smelling of earth and time. He showed me where the plumbing ran, where the main supports were, his voice filled with a rediscovered knowledge he'd learned at his father's side. He made a list. On a yellow legal pad, he wrote in his neat, architectural script. Check all wiring in attic and basement. Inspect roof flashing around chimney. Replace loose board in hall. Reglaze north-facing windows before winter. Service the furnace. It was not a list of problems of liabilities. It was a plan of action. It was a promise made tangible. Each item he wrote down felt like a brick being laid in the foundation of our rebuilt trust. He left just after lunch, his SUV looking much less menacing as it drove away in the daylight. His hug was strong, full of purpose. "I'll be back in 2 weeks, Mom. We'll start with the attic. And I'll call you every couple of days. No matter what." The 2 weeks that followed were a quiet eternity. The house felt different with him gone. The silence had returned, but its character had changed. It was no longer the oppressive silence of dread, but the pensive silence of waiting. I found myself cleaning with a renewed vigor, not out of nervous habit, but out of pride. I polished the silver wedding frame on the mantel. I washed the windows until they sparkled, letting in as much of the mountain light as possible. I was getting my house ready for my son's return. I was tending to the soul of our home. David was true to his word. He called every other night. The conversations were a mixture of practical and personal. He'd ask about the old tomcat on the porch, and I'd ask about his work. He told me his talks with Rebecca were strained, difficult. She felt betrayed. He felt awakened. They were at an impasse, living in the same city, but on different emotional planets. I could hear the sadness in his voice, and I ached for him, but I did not offer advice. This was a path he had to walk himself. All I could do was keep the light on at home for him, a beacon on his own personal mountain. 2 weeks later, his SUV appeared on the driveway, right on schedule. And for the next 6 months, that became our new rhythm. Every other Saturday morning, he would arrive, his car full of tools and supplies. We would spend the day working. We crawled through the dusty attic, an old flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and he inspected the wiring, declaring it old but safe, with no signs of fraying. "Dad used the good stuff, Mom." He over-engineered everything, he'd said with a laugh that echoed his father's. We spent a beautiful July weekend reglazing the old wooden windows, the sun warm on our backs. As we worked, pressing the putty into the frames, stories would surface. I told him about the day his father had installed these very windows, how he'd cut his hand and I'd made such a fuss over it. He told me about a little cafe near his office, about a project he was proud of. We were talking again, truly talking, not just exchanging pleasantries. We were weaving the fabric of our relationship back together, one shared memory, one new task at a time. One Saturday in late September, as the leaves on the maples were beginning to turn to fire, we were on the porch, replacing a step that had started to feel spongy underfoot. The air was crisp and clean. David was measuring a piece of cedar, the same focused expression on his face that Robert always had when he worked with wood. The sound of his saw cutting through the plank was a sound of healing. Then another car appeared on the gravel drive. A small, unfamiliar rental car. It pulled up behind David's SUV, and my heart gave a familiar, anxious leap. The driver's side door opened, and Rebecca got out. She looked different. Thinner. Her usual impeccable business attire was replaced with simple jeans and a sweater. Her hair was tied back, and she wore no makeup. She looked younger and more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. She didn't march toward us. She stood by her car, her hands shoved deep in her pockets, looking at us. At David, kneeling on the porch with a hammer in his hand. At me, sitting on the top step, holding a box of screws. David stopped sawing. He stood up slowly, wiping sawdust from his jeans. The air grew thick with unspoken words, with months of anger and distance. "Becca," he said, his voice quiet. She took a tentative step forward. Her eyes weren't on David. They were on the house. She scanned the porch, the newly glazed windows glinting in the autumn sun, the solid new step waiting to be installed. She wasn't looking with a critical eye, not this time. It was a look of confusion, of trying to understand something that had long eluded her. "Your sister said you were here," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "Every other weekend." David just nodded. "I told you I would be." She walked closer, stopping at the edge of the lawn. In her hands, I now saw she was holding something. A small potted tree, its leaves a brilliant shade of crimson. A Japanese maple. I went to a therapist, she said, her gaze dropping to the ground. I needed to understand why I got so obsessed, why I couldn't let it go. She looked up, and for the first time, she looked directly at me. There were tears in her eyes. She helped me see that it wasn't about you, Helen. Not really. It was about me. My parents, they got old, and it was messy. And scary. My father's illness was long and hard, and my mother just gave up after he was gone. I felt so helpless. I couldn't control any of it. Her voice broke, but she pushed on. When I looked at you up here, I just saw it all happening again. And I thought if I could just control the environment, if I could put you somewhere safe, then I could control the outcome. I could prevent the mess, prevent the pain. It wasn't about helping you. It was about protecting myself from having to feel that helpless again. She took a ragged breath. It was selfish. And it was cruel. And I am so sorry. It wasn't an excuse. It was an explanation. It was a raw, painful confession from a woman terrified of life's inevitable hardships. I looked at her, at the trembling pot in her hands, and the last, hard knot of anger in my chest began to loosen. I stood up. I walked down the steps and stood in front of her. I looked at the little tree. It's beautiful, Rebecca. She held it out to me, a silent offering. I thought, maybe it could go in the garden, to put down new roots. David came and stood beside me, putting his arm around my shoulders. He looked at his wife, his eyes full of a complicated mix of pain and love. There's a spot by the bird bath, I said softly. It gets the morning sun. Your father-in-law would have liked that. That afternoon, the three of us worked together in the garden. David dug the hole, his movements sure and strong. I knelt and prepared the soil, my fingers sinking into the rich, dark earth. And Rebecca, on her knees beside me, gently unwrapped the roots of the little tree and settled it into its new home. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The shared, silent work was its own language. It was a language of truce, of beginning again. The future is still an unwritten page. I know that one afternoon of planting a tree does not erase a year of pain. The marriage of my son and his wife is a fragile thing, being rebuilt just as carefully as we are repairing this old house. There will be more difficult conversations, more moments of doubt. But there is hope now, where before there was only war. It is winter again on Black Bear Ridge. The snow lies in a thick, pristine blanket over the ground, muffling the world in a holy quiet. The little maple tree Rebecca brought is a delicate, dark skeleton against the white, its branches reaching for the sky, waiting patiently for spring. I am sitting in Robert's armchair, the fire crackling in the stone fireplace. A new photograph has been added to the mantel. It was taken on that September afternoon, the three of us standing by the newly planted tree, our faces smudged with dirt. We are not smiling perfect smiles, but there is a sense of peace in our eyes. My son calls every few days, his voice lighter than it has been in years. He and Rebecca are still in therapy. They are learning a new way to talk to each other, a new way to love. They are coming for Christmas. Rebecca asked if she could help me bake Robert's favorite gingerbread cookies. I told her I would love that. I am not lonely. This house, it breathes with me. It is filled not just with the ghosts of a happy past, but with the echoes of recent healing, with the promise of a future. I look at my hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, and I see the hands that held my husband's, that raised my son, that helped to build these walls, and that held firm when the storm came. I kept my promise to Robert. I stayed. Our roots held. The soul of this house, built one good deed, one loving act, one moment of forgiveness at a time, is safe. And as the snow falls softly outside my window, I feel a profound and quiet joy. I am Helen Anderson, and I am home.